And welcome to another Down the Rabbit Hole video. I wanted to throw my hat in the ring of a bit of cinematic controversy that people have argued for decades. In the film Blade Runner, is Deckard, that Harrison Ford plays, a replicant? Because there seems to be conflicting arguments left, right, and center on this whole subject. It's even got to the point where Ridley Scott, in a recent DVD release, said on the commentary, if you don't know by now that Deckard is a replicant, you're a moron. In which case, I'm going to say I'm a moron because, in my opinion, there's a lot of evidence that people use that say he is definitely a replicant, and I don't think that evidence is valid. So I wanted to go through those points. Now, I do want to say it's all a matter of opinion. So when people are always claiming that Ridley Scott was quoted recently as saying, yes, I know he was definitely a replicant, as evidence that he filmed it that way, I think that's a bit weak of an argument, but we'll get there. Yeah, it is, in my opinion, it's an interpretation thing, and I'm reminded of a Saturday Night Live skit of all things. I was going to show it, but YouTube won't allow it. Edward Asner did a skit about 20 years ago where he's retiring from a nuclear power plant, and all of his co-workers are sending him off, and he says before he leaves, his final bit of wisdom, you can't put too much water on a nuclear reactor. And then he says farewell and he leaves. And one of the co-workers instantly says, well, I better go put some more water on the reactor. And the other co-workers are like, no, you can't put too much water on a reactor. That's what he just said. And the point of the skit is, it depends on what way you interpret that sentence. You can't put too much water on a reactor. That means it's not possible to put too much water on a reactor? You mean you can douse it constantly? Or you got to be careful not to put too much water on a reactor. So that's that skit. Now, on dealing with is Deckard a replicant, we run into exactly that same kind of phenomenon. There was something that was written down in one of the versions of the scripts that Ridley Scott interpreted one way, different from the way the writers interpreted it. So, and I'll leave it up to you to decide for yourself. For me personally, it proves that in the original inception of making the film, there was no indication that Deckard was going to be a replicant. But let's go through what they quote as the evidence that he is. First of all, the most important thing, Gaff leaves a origami unicorn at his apartment. That has been quoted as the quintessential piece of evidence because in the director's cut, Deckard dreams of unicorns. And the book, or the movie, is based on the book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? So anything to do with dream states would be the best indicator. Therefore, if Deckard dreams of unicorns and Gaff was there, this must be proof. We'll get to that one. Also, there's a scene where Deckard is behind Rachel in a shot, and his eyes are glowing like her eyes glow, the Blade Runner replicant glow. I've got a counter-argument to that as well. Furthermore, there are other side bits of evidence. For example, when he's hanging off the building at the end and Batty grabs his hand and pulls him up, they say he grabs him and he goes, kinship! And he pulls him up to set him down. And that kinship line is to show, see, Roy Batty knew they had a brother kind of kinship. And there is actually a version of the script where that is exactly what Deckard says. Roy Batty and I were brothers. We'll get to that as well. Let's go through each of these arguments and analyze whether or not it does prove or disprove the Deckard is a replicant thing. But I thought it was worth starting off by just reminding that the film was actually made to discuss the line drawn between what is life and what isn't. So thematically, the filmmakers, the writers of the script, and also Ridley Scott, were trying to emphasize the parallel of these people that lived in this futuristic city, how human are they, and the replicants who wanted to be human, who were very passionate about being human. So you're going to see some interesting parallels. But yeah, let's go through each of these points. Here we are at the very beginning of the film. It says quite clearly, after a bloody mutiny by a Nexus 6 combat team on an off-world colony, replicants were declared illegal on Earth on penalty of death.
I need you, Death. This is the worst yet. I need the old Blade Runner. I need your magic.
If replicants were illegal on Earth, why would Bryant have so much faith that he could just send Deckard out? If they all knew that he was a replicant, he could just send him out into the world to go and find these other replicants. It's a strange contradiction, and it's within the first 10 minutes of the opening of the film. I would think they would be consistent in their messaging.
Sushi, that's what my ex-wife called me. Cold fish.
Okay, so there's one of them. People say, yeah, there's an indicator that he's obviously unemotional and like a robot. But later on, he does kind of defend that comment.
A daughter, she never was. Replicants weren't supposed to have feelings. Neither were Blade Runners. What the hell was happening to me?
You see, he comments right there. If he has any emotions, he's not doing his job properly. Blade Runners weren't supposed to have feelings.
Not very sporting to fire at an unarmed opponent. Come on. Show me. There you go.
Okay, so how does Batty know what Deckard's name is? Well, I would argue he found out earlier in the film because Leon was there at a certain scene. Let me get to that. Leon was there when Zora was killed. And in fact, in the scene we were just looking at, where Batty is about to break Deckard's fingers, he even says, "This is for Zora!" Clearly Leon called Batty and told him, because, as you're about to see, Deckard identifies himself to the local
The
cop.
report would be routine retirement of a replicant, which didn't make me feel any better about shooting a woman in the back.
Deckard. Beat 263.54.
See, he was right there. Many thanks to my wife for pointing that one out. Alright, this is the big one. The eyes. She's got the glowing Blade Runner eyes in these scenes, and he does at the end of it.
What if I go north?
It's actually done with photographic trick.
Disappear. Would you come after me?
Now you're going to see he's going to walk behind her, and I'm going to explain this trick.
I owe you.
Watch carefully. Her eyes glow, and so do his right here.
But somebody would.
So I'm now going to cut to a very rudimentary recreation of the photographic trick to show you how that was done and also why it would impact Harrison Ford in that shot. And worth noting, I couldn't quite get the eyes to glow except for during the setup of the thing. So I'm actually going to show in slow motion. You do actually see the eye glow for a couple of shots. Unfortunately, when I'm actually showing you the setup, it doesn't do the glow. So my apologies in advance, but there's a couple of bits that you can see the glow there. Okay, so as mentioned, just look at my right eye, or in this case, on your screen it'll be on the left. See how it's glowing there? Yeah, that was what I was trying to go for with the rest of this experiment I'm about to show you. And unfortunately, when it actually came time to recording it, you couldn't actually see that glow. So just wanted to throw in this little take here during the setup to prove the eyes, at least one of my eyes, did actually glow with the proper Blade Runner glow. That'll make a great thumbnail. Now, how do you do Blade Runner eyes? I've got a rig set up here, and I'll reverse the camera in a minute to give you an idea. It's very basic. It's not like what they had in the studio, but I'm hoping it shows that my eyes have these like highlights right now. And that would have been in the studio on a much larger scale. They had, apparently from what I've read, a big filter and a large reflector. I've just got a little light, but I'm kind of getting the same idea across. So in the scene, this light would have been shining in Sean Young's eyes, and she would have been here like this. And then Harrison Ford would have done his bit where he comes across and says, "But someone would." And as you can see, my eyes also have the light in them, and that's because of the way the rig is, which I will show you now. Okay, so roughly here is my setup, and this is just to give you an idea of how this works. So there's the chair, there's the light source, and I've put a couple of boxes in the way just so it doesn't show on my face. But the trick is the camera is actually got a piece of glass between it. So the light bounces off the glass, and then the camera is pointed at me. So from my point of view, what I'm seeing is a camera with a light. And again, Sean Young would have been here, Harrison Ford would have been here. They both would have had the light in their eyes. So here we are at the final scene of the film. Listen very carefully to what Rutger Hauer says here. When he grabs his hand, I heard Kin Shihi, if anything, but it sounded more like a grunt to me, or maybe gotcha, maybe? So I'm going to put a link down below to an article I read on this very subject. A fan went to an event that Rutger Hauer was signing autographs and asked him about the kinship line, and apparently even sent him a letter later on. All the details are in the link below. But Rutger Hauer actually replied to this fellow saying, "Dear Mr. Morano, I'll just get this back to you, otherwise I'll forget about it. Kinship was never used. Gotcha is a small possibility, tiny. I tend to remember quite well what I said in my performances, and I hardly improvise. So a grunt is most likely to be there." So there we go. If Rutger Hauer himself says that he did not say kinship, I think that's a pretty good resource for what was actually said on set. Well, you know we had to do this. It's time for the unicorn. Okay, so there's a unicorn on the floor, an origami unicorn. How that's to indicate that this means that Deckard is a replicant is a little gray, especially in the original cut of the film. We'll just cut to a few more here.
You can read those based on the way you punch them.
Okay, so Gaff made a little chicken in the cop headquarters. Does that mean that Bryant is a chicken? And here we are in Leon's apartment. Gaff just leaves little origami figures all over the place. Remember, this is referencing a lot of film noir, and the idea of the calling card was in a lot of those old 1930s films. So my contention is these are just things that Gaff leaves around to indicate he was here. Not that these are indications of what your dreams are. And again, Ridley Scott may have filmed the scene with the unicorn around the same time. There's quite a few documentaries that talk about that. But the fact that a silver unicorn was left at Deckard's apartment to indicate, yes, we know what your dreams are, is a little bit weak. Alright, so in conclusion, we do have to address the multiple scripts, because in there are a lot of different ways that this could be interpreted. To really cover the making of Blade Runner properly, I highly, highly recommend this book, Future Noir, The Making of Blade Runner by Paul M. Semon. Fantastic resource, has tons of interviews and all kinds of archival information. The most important part, though, that I want to discuss happens on page 359, Deckard, a Replicant. But I'm going to touch on the most important parts here right now. So, actually starting on page 360, the idea of Deckard actually being an android sort of invented itself, Hampton Fancher recalls. He was the first writer of the script. In the final version of the screenplay I wrote before David Peoples stepped in, which I'm not sure he ever saw, I ended the film with Deckard coming back home and sitting down at his piano. There was a close-up of Deckard's hand going down toward the keys, and suddenly his hand cramped up, kind of like Roy Batty's did. You weren't quite sure it was the same thing. It looked an awful lot like a Replicant clench. Then that image froze, the music came up, and that was it, the end, the last shot in the picture. I wanted the audience to walk away thinking, is Deckard like Batty? That was my whole point in creating this ending in the first place. The idea was supposed to be, take your own empathy test. Constantly monitor your own emotional temperature. See how human you really are, because we can always be better at being human. It was a philosophical challenge. That's all the notion of Deckard being a replicant originally meant to me. After David Peoples began his Blade Runner writing, however, Fancher's initial concept concerning Deckard's true humanity underwent a mutation and a misunderstanding, and this brings us back to that Saturday Night Live skit I was talking about. In the ending I wrote for my first draft of December 15th, 1980, Peoples himself explains, Deckard kills Gaff because Gaff tried to terminate Rachel. Then Deckard takes Rachel to the beach and he kills her too. Next he returns to his apartment. Now he's sitting in his bedroom laying out ammunition for his gun because Deckard knows that someone from the police department is going to come to his apartment and try and shoot him for murdering Gaff. At this point I invented a kind of contemplative voiceover for Deckard. Here, let me read it to you, and this is where Peoples actually grabs his script from December the 15th. I wonder who designs the ones like me, and what choices we really have, and which ones we just think we have. I wonder if I had really loved her. I wonder which of my memories were real, and which belonged to someone else. The great Tyrell hadn't designed me, but whoever hadn't done so much better. You're programmed too, she told me, and she was right. In my own modest way, I was a combat model. Roy Batty was my late brother. That's that reference we talked about earlier. Now, what I'd intended to do with this voiceover was mostly metaphysical, Peoples continues, and that's, I think, critical to this whole argument. Deckard was supposed to be philosophically questioning himself about what it was that made him so different from Rachel and the other replicants. He was supposed to be realizing that on the human level they weren't so different. That Deckard wanted the same thing the replicants did. The maker he was referencing wasn't literally Tyrell either. It was supposed to be God. So basically Deckard was just musing about what it meant to be human. But then Ridley, Peoples says, laughing, well, I think Ridley misinterpreted me, because right about this period of time he started announcing, aha! Deckard is a replicant! What brilliance! How very heavy metal! I was sort of confused by this response because Ridley kept giving me all of this praise and credit for this terrific idea. And the chapter goes on. I won't read much further. But you can see that the original script was trying to be metaphysical, talking about what is it to be human. And these references that David Peoples had about my maker were metaphysical. They were about what it is to be human in the eyes of God, or spiritual. Unfortunately, when Ridley Scott read that, he thought, oh, his maker, of course, he's a replicant. So, of course, Ridley Scott now says, yes, Deckard was supposed to be a replicant all along. And that's why when the director's cut came out, the unicorn sequence was reinserted, and this took on a whole new meaning. But if you ask me, it doesn't quite make sense. I would much rather cling to the idea that it was a metaphysical reference to a maker. It wasn't a literal, somebody put me together, nuts and bolts maker reference. Anyway, this is one of those arguments that'll go on forever. I just wanted to put in my 2 cents worth and quote from this book, because that section about the maker, that dawned on me, the whole argument spawned from that. You can draw different parallels, different explanations out of the movie that you want. But I think this book nails it on the head. Anyway, we'll see you down the rabbit hole.